Welcome everybody to the presentation about the Land and Water Conservation Fund for this year's grant round. We are currently open, so I want to provide some information that might be helpful in preparing an application. The Land and Water Conservation Fund is a national grant program through the National Park Service, and so it functions across the United States. So as I've gotten much more familiar with the program, I start seeing these signs everywhere, which is what I included here, just a couple of spots in other states that we have had, that I visited, that have Land and Water Conservation Fund projects, but there are many throughout the state of Maryland, and there will be even more next year. So just this is a whole lot of text, but just to give you the legal background for this program, which I'll be referring to as LWCF. It was established in 1965, and it's for 50-50 matching grants to state and local governments and also tribes for the purpose of acquiring or developing public outdoor recreational areas and facilities. And part of this grant program is that it protects the property forever for outdoor recreation purposes. So the property can't be converted to other than public outdoor recreation uses. For those of you who've worked on program open space, there's a somewhat similar provision for properties acquired with program open space funding. For Land and Water Conservation Fund, it applies to both development and acquisition, and covers the entirety of the park, not just where the particular project is happening. And this year we have just opened the open project selection process, which is our state level process for soliciting applications and choosing ones that are going to go forward to federal application. So it's kind of a two-step process. Right now, we're in more of a pre-application phase where you're presenting to the state a project, and then those that we select will go on to the second stage, which is federal application to the National Park Service. So we don't ask that you prepare every single document that they're going to require at the federal level at this point, but once we've selected which ones are going to move forward, then we will put together all of those documents. The application period is currently open, and it's going to be open until June 24th at 5 p.m. The requests can go from $50,000 to $3 million. This is an increased maximum from last year, which was it was $2.5 million last year. That means, because this is a 50-50 cost share program, that the total project cost could be from $100,000 at the minimum to $6 million at the total. So those matching funds, fill out the difference between the grant amount and the project amount. All the information can be found on our webpage. You can really Google Maryland LWCF, or you go to tinyurl.com/Maryland LWCF, or use the QR code on this page, which will be up on a couple other slides too. Few important dates. So I already covered that we're open now. During this time where you're developing an application process, I am available to meet individually with counties, municipalities about projects that you're thinking about putting forward. I can give you an initial read on whether it is suitable for the program, and help answer any questions you might have about preparing the application. So you can schedule a time to meet with me using tinyurl.com/LWCF meeting. Clicking that link, or going to the landing page for LWCF, there's a link there to schedule a meeting. You could also contact me. I'll include my email on the last slide of this presentation. June 24th at 5 p.m., the applications, which are really pre-applications, are due to DNR. And then over the summer, my colleagues and I will review the applications so that we should hopefully get back to you by September 15th. If your project was selected to move forward, or if we have comments about, what might make it a better application for the next year. And then in fall 2026 and spring 2027, I will work with selected applicants on the federal application. There's a whole bunch of information that goes in, and they're very particular about it. So we'll work on developing all those different materials in that time. And this is only my best guess based on previous experience, that the award date for this project would be October 1, 2027. So this can be a little bit challenging because we ask for you to have a lot of information about the project that you're putting together, but we're not expecting that you'll be able to start it until, a year and a half-ish from now. So when you're thinking about projects, definitely thinking about the timeline can be very important to find something that you know a lot about, but that doesn't need to necessarily start happening until over a year from now. The project start date, which I would estimate to be October 1, 2027, is when you can start incurring expenses for the project. So you can't, break ground until you have that start date for the project. Some of the big program requirements, there is a massive manual that details all the different program requirements put together by the National Park Service. So this is not an exhaustive list, but some of the big highlights. As I mentioned in the legal background, this protects the land in perpetuity, and it applies to the entire park, not just the project area. So we as DNR are supposed to go out and inspect every property every 5 years to ensure that it's still publicly accessible, it's still devoted to outdoor recreation, and generally that it's still in line with Land and Water Conservation Fund. If we find that there has been some kind of non-recreation purpose or it's not being open to the public, then we would contact project sponsors, which are the counties and municipalities that carry out LWCF projects, about resolving that issue or potentially initiating a conversion process. This is definitely something we want to avoid. So that's also important to think about when you're selecting a project that might be a good project for LWCF. Like if you have heard murmurs that the library is interested in building on some portion of parkland, then that might be something that's not a good candidate for LWCF because of this restriction. If you have a property within your county or municipality that has previously received LWCF fund and is therefore under protection, that might be a good candidate because you're not necessarily adding any further restrictions on the property, but you can reinvest in it using LWCF funds. Also, as I mentioned, it's a 50-50 match with non-federal funds. So you can use state funds, you can use program open space, you can use local funds, you can use donated funds, and that includes donated acquisition properties. And you can also use in-kind contributions. And then there are some specific federal funds that can be used as matching funds, like Recreational Trails Program and Community Development Block Grant. These are less common, but so generally we're looking at 50% non-federal, can be made up of a variety of different sources as long as it's not federal funding. And then it's a reimbursement program. The funds will not be distributed to the project sponsor until the project is complete. Projects have to be completed within 3 years of the LWCF start date. So for this one, with that estimated start date of October 1, 2027, we would be looking at September 30th, 2030 as the original end date for this project. So you'd have to be completing all the work between the start date and that end. There is a possibility to extend this the project period for up to 2 years, so possibly to 2032. But that we would have to go through an additional process for it. And then an LWCF sign must be placed at the park. You might be familiar with this from Community Parks and Playground or Program Open Space. We have a lot of flexibility in how the signage can be added. It can be a standalone sign. It can be a logo added to an existing sign, but you do need to keep a sign recognizing LWCF at the park entrance or near the funded element. So the review process for step 1, which is that pre-application where the state is reviewing, we will look for eligibility. So you will make sure that the project fits the requirements of LWCF and then rank them based on their contributions to recreation and conservation, their feasibility, and their alignment with the state LPRP and the relevant county LPPRP. I'll note here that the state LPRP The one that's posted online, it says that it expires in 2022. We had an extension, and so that's still the active one that we're going to be using. If you look at the materials online for the application, there is a document outlining the criteria that we're using to evaluate these projects. So you can essentially see the rubric that we're using. So you can, write your application keeping those things in mind. And then also the goals from the last LPRP are listed on the application. So you don't necessarily need to go searching through our LPRP. We've provided that. For the LPRP, you can use the one that was most recently published. There's one being developed right now for all the counties, but you can use the one that's currently in effect. And then the review process, step 2, for those that are selected by the state to move forward to federal application, we'll work with you to develop all the materials. And there's a number of things that kinds of review that your project goes through. First, environmental review. Most projects end up being eligible for a categorical exclusion under the National Environmental Protection Act. And so we don't usually at this point have to send projects forward for an environmental assessment, but we'll need to evaluate sort of the environmental impacts of your project, which is definitely something to keep in mind when selecting a project that might be appropriate for LWCF. We'll go through historical review and have the Maryland Historical Trust look at the property. Projects may not have an adverse impact on historic resources. So again, something to keep in mind when you're selecting a project. And then finally, tribal review is kind of unique to LWCF for the grant programs that we administer. The National Park Service really facilitates this conversation, but sends project information about where we're going to impact the land and how deep we'll have disturbance of the soil. We'll share that with leaders of tribes that have native homelands in Maryland, and then we may have concerns to address. The biggest places where we've gotten reviews back from tribes that we need to make changes or have monitoring is when we have like deep level disturbance, also particularly properties near rivers, properties that are known to have had Native American artifacts, anything like that. For LWCF, there are some things that we could cover, some things that we can't. And just to be clear, these all items, whether they're being covered by grant funds or match funds, need to be eligible. Eligible costs include land acquisition. And if you're doing an acquisition, we need to have a Yellow Book appraisal and review appraisal. So this is a specific federal kind of appraisal. If you're looking at doing an acquisition or combined acquisition development project, we can talk more about how to get those kinds of appraisals. They're a little bit harder to find than a standard appraisal. Other eligible costs include any outdoor recreation facility. So trails, fields, piers, anything like that that is for outdoor recreation. In addition, there can be some indoor facilities and other facilities that support outdoor recreation, even if they're not recreation themselves. So restrooms would be a very classic building that we can support with LWCF. If you have a restroom building that you want to build that is going to be next to a playground or a pavilion or something like that, that's definitely something we can support. Roads, parking, those aren't directly for recreation. However, they are going to support the recreation at the site. And then I know I told you that generally costs can't be incurred until after the start date for the project. However, it is possible to get certain pre-award engineering and design costs approved. Those have to be approved during the application process. We have to know how much you're spending and when you started spending it. But that can help to cover design costs that you may even have already started incurring as you plan for your project. There are some common ineligible costs that I've listed. Both of these, they're not exhaustive lists, but they're some of the most common. We don't cover appraisal and appraisal review fees. We don't cover primarily indoor recreation facilities, so something like an indoor pool, meeting room, etc. And then we don't cover any other costs other than those pre-approved, pre-award engineering and design costs that are incurred outside the project period, and then also don't cover restoration of historic features. Some recent projects, and these are the ones that we're going to hear from in a little bit. Steve and Lee, I'm going to come back to you on a later slide, but just to give a background of the projects that they completed in Ocean City and Wycomico County. Ocean City Downtown Recreation Complex brought in basketball and pickleball / tennis courts, a park office and restrooms, playgrounds, benches, bike racks, and water fountains. And to note on this project, you can ask Leah a little bit more about it. There were other ineligible costs that were being incurred for a larger project, but they weren't included in the LWCF project. So like some indoor facility parts couldn't really be covered by LWCF, and they were happening concurrently, but by tracking those expenses, we were able to break out sort of the LWCF project and then the non-LWCF component of this larger redevelopment of Bayside Park. And then Pirates Wharf in Wycomico County, phase 1 covered parking and roadways, trails, pavilion and comfort station, and playground. How to apply? You can find that application online on the LWCF page, and there's some information that it'll go through. We're asking for the basic information about you and the project with a description. We'll ask you to describe the recreational and conservation benefits, alignment with the LPRP and county LPRP, your project timeline and readiness to help us understand if you're in that right time frame for this round of applications, information about your public engagement that you have done or plan to do, public access and ADA accessibility, and then an itemized budget, which we'll show in more detail, and a local government authorization that just shows that you're sort of authorized to submit this application. And then we also ask for development applications for you to submit a site development plan. So this should show any of the items that were detailed in your description or your budget, and then an SDAT record or deed proving ownership. You can find those at our landing page. For the budget, items, as I mentioned, should clearly match your site plan and your project description. So if you include a playground in your site plan or your description, I want to see playground construction in your budget just to make sure that we're covering all the costs you want to have in your project. And I recommend a 50-50 split between every single line item. This can just kind of make sure that we end up with a 50-50 split at the bottom. However, I recognize that in some instances, you might not be able to do that, or you might have a preference to do it another way. My goal is to have every project be 50% covered by LWCF and 50% not. So at the total line, that's what I want. But if you have a grant that specifically only covers playground development, but you also want to build a pavilion, we can do something where, you know, all the playground development is covered by matching funds, and then the pavilion is covered by LWCF. And then indicate on the budget if any costs are pre-award engineering and design, because we'll need to specify that when we apply for the grant. And then you can review the LWCF manual for any other guidance on eligible or ineligible costs, and also contact me for any of that. This year, there is an Excel workbook posted on the webpage to help complete your budget. I have built in that 50-50 split between line items, so you can change that if you need to, but the automatic calculations are going to split everything 50-50 between LWCF and matching. So this just gives an example of some of the things that could go on the budget. Trail network engineering and design is an eligible pre-award cost, so I just want to indicate that on the budget. And then I've got that 50-50 split down everything, and just a description or a short title on the far left for what you're covering. And then if you need to add any other description that might help me understand the cost, then that can be added on the far right side in the description. For the site plan, The most important thing is that I understand what's happening where. And so this can be done in a variety of ways. If you have ArcGIS online or ArcGIS capabilities within your department, that's great. It can be an easy way to put together a site plan on aerial imagery. I do recommend aerial imagery just because I can see very clearly what is there currently and then what you're looking to do in the future. But I think also this one on the far left could have been put together in Paint or some other program with a screenshot from Google Maps or something. But I just want to be able to see what items from your budget, from your description, are going in where. This one's a little bit more complicated on the right side, but I wanted to be able to see where the parking lots will be, where the multi-purpose fields will be, and anything that's included in the project. Okay, so this is kind of a restating of what we've covered already, that successful applicants will be notified by September 15th. We'll also notify you if your application was not successful by then, and work with the applicant for multiple months to prepare that federal application. And then applicants receive a start date, which my best estimate for this round is October 1, 2027. So let's say a grant is awarded. A couple things happen during the grant period. Of course, you're carrying out the work of the project. And then I will request quarterly reports on work status and funds expended. And one of my primary goals in doing so is to catch if you have any need for scope for any kind of amendment. There's 3 types of amendments. There's a cost amendment, and if Maryland has funds available, we can often increase the total cost of your LWCF grant. Of course, you'll also have to come up with matching funds to match that increase in the grant. We can do scope amendments. However, I caution you against doing scope increase amendments because they tend to take a long time. They kind of head back to the original kinds of reviews that we did on the project, particularly if we're doing a scope amendment that increases the area of disturbance, because that triggers more historic tribal review, and they end up taking a very long time. It is sometimes possible to, let's say, change a basketball court to a pickleball court in your from your original grant to your current grant, because that's something where the area is going to be the same, the depth of disturbance is pretty similar, but generally scope increase amendments are the most time consuming. Occasionally we do scope decrease amendments. These tend to happen right when we're coming up against the final deadline for the grant, and we realize that you're not going to be able to complete the scope of the grant within the time allowed. And then we also have time extensions. These are the easiest amendments to get. We just need to say why you're experiencing a slowdown and how long you want to extend your grant for. And that is for up to an additional 2 years. And then after that, we really cannot extend it any longer. So the very maximum for these grants is 5 years. For the reimbursement process, as I mentioned, the project has to be fully complete before the reimbursement process can begin. I'll conduct a site inspection just to check all those scope items and to make sure there's a sign with the LWCF logo. And then you'll gather any documentation, invoices, proof of payment, and a summary spreadsheet so that I can put that all together for the National Park Service. If you are using in-kind contributions, whether through volunteers or employees, you will need to provide a work log with signatures from all of them and the times that they were working. So this is something that you really need to think about early on in the process, not just when we're going towards reimbursement. And then I'll submit them to the National Park Service and assist with reimbursement to the project sponsor. It can take a while to get those 2 layers of government to reimburse you. So definitely allow some time for that reimbursement process. Common causes of delay, any impacts on historic properties or archaeological concerns about ground disturbance are definitely things that can sort of slow down those review processes that I outlined. Permitting from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So this would be for work happening in navigable waters. Or other permitting issues can cause issues because, we have the timeline for the grant and then you have the timeline for the permits. And if they're sort of out of sync, that can be an issue. And then potential for significant environmental impact might lead us down the way of needing to do an environmental assessment. And so that would be something that's going to cause delays as you put together that assessment. And then complicated deed restrictions, easements, or rights of way, something that makes it a little less clear that you have full rights to the property on which you're developing. We do look at that as we develop the application, and so that can be a challenge. And then changes to the proposed scope after the application, as I was just mentioning, can be a challenge. As I mentioned, many counties and municipalities do have properties that are already under LWCF protections. And that can help at least with thinking about like complicated deed restrictions and property ownership. So if you go to our website for LWCF, there's a link to the public viewer, and you can filter by the project sponsor to see what project may have occurred within your county or municipality before you submit a project, and see if there might be some parks that have already received LWCF funds that are already under protections from this program. So that is accessible on the LWCF website. Other causes of delays, lack of a plan/site map for development activities. You don't need to have it fully lined out. You don't need to have engineering drawings. In fact, they prefer not to have engineering drawings. But we need to generally know what's going to happen where. So the project needs to be formed enough that you know that you're going to be, building a pavilion in this area, so that we can see what areas are going to be disturbed and do all those different reviews. And then any inconsistencies between different forms of information, as I mentioned, just lining up that project description, budget line, items, and site map. And I find that this most often happens when you do have a larger project that bigger than just the grant. And so you're trying to figure out which parts you want to be covering by the grant. So things sort of move in and out of the LWCF application. But for the purpose of your application, we really care about what's included in the grant. So that includes both what's paid for by the LWCF grant and the matching funding. This is a really quick note. The Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program is a sub grant, or not, it is a type of grant that is ruled by the same manual, same regulations as LWCF, but it was particularly developed for census tracts that are disadvantaged, and particularly for more densely populated areas. The grant awards for this can go very high. Most counties and municipalities aren't going to be able to come up with the matching funds for something like a $15 million project. However, there are a lot of funds that sometimes are available through the Outdoor Recreation Legacy Partnership Program. So I want you to know that it's around. However, it's currently not accepting applications. If you have a project in mind for something within an area with a population over 25,000, if you're interested in potentially in the future developing an ORLAP application, which skip the state review and go straight to federal, you can reach out to me. We're hoping that it'll become available soon, but this is something that's kind of been stuck since the change in administration at the federal level. Okay, so that was a whole bunch of information, but I wanted to just introduce you to former grant recipients, and I guess current for former and current for Pirates Wharf, Leah Dyson and Steve Miller. Yeah, would you mind introducing yourself, Leah, and then I'll go to Steve and then ask you to give a little description of your project.
Sure. I'm Leah Dyson. I'm the grants manager for the town of Ocean City. And I worked with Molly on our LWCF grant that helped rehabilitate Bayside Park at 3rd Street here in downtown Ocean City. And I don't know if you wanted me to go into some more detail about the grant now or...
Let's go to Steve and then we'll come back to you. Just, yeah.
Hi, good afternoon. Steve Miller. I'm the Director of Recreation Parks and Tourism for Wycomico County. The project we did for phase one we completed was Pirates Wharf. It's about a 300-acre property along the Wycomico River. So the first phase was, as you see on the screen, the different portions up to the playground. This second phase, which we're now contracting as we speak, will be most of the waterfront activities, boat ramp, fishing pier, observation decks. And be happy to share more here in a minute as to our experience, but it certainly made this project possible.
Awesome. Yeah, Leah, you want to share a little more about the grant or the project?
Sure. So I actually came into my position here with the town when this LWCF project was underway. We'd already received the grant funds, and our former Recreation and Parks Director, Susan Petito, had really spearheaded the project. So I got a lot more involved when she retired about a year ago. But the project itself was many, many years in the making. I think public engagement maybe started about 10 years ago, and just because of the way funding ebbs and flows, it really just finally got finished here recently. The park itself is about 4 acres, and the project totaled over $6.5 million, with LWCF funds making up about 1.4 million of that, plus our match portion. So it brought the project funding total to about 2.8 million. And part of the way through the grant, we actually had gotten an increase in our funding. And I think Molly talked about that process during her presentation, where we were initially awarded 1 million, found that some costs had increased over time, and so we were able to receive some additional funds. But one of the key pieces for us throughout the project, and I can't speak to too much of how it worked initially because I wasn't here for the application project, but we had to make sure that we were able to differentiate all of our LWCF funded project components from the rest of the project, which was all very large. Just a lot of work over a lot of time. But a real key piece of making sure that we stayed on track and identified all the eligible expenses was really working very closely with Molly. And prior to her joining DNR, I believe Susan worked with Carrie Lotsky. So their guidance was really critical to our success throughout the course of the project. Let's see. To help make up the difference and then to fund our match portion, we leveraged bond funds. And so that created maybe some challenges in how we tracked the project expenses that we sort of learned from as we went through the program. So normally, as the town, when we get grant funds, we use a specific project code to track all those expenses, and makes it very clear and very, very clean. But because of the size and the complexity of this project, we had to do a little bit more manual auditing to ensure that all of the expenses that were attached to this grant were applied, and then anything that was ineligible or excluded was extracted from our reporting and from that final reimbursement request. So that was a little bit of a learning experience for us in that manual piece, but working through it, I think, really helped prepare us for additional federal funding for this type of project. And let's see, what else might be helpful as I look through my notes, but it was really important as we worked through that. We had a lot of different departments involved in the project, from our recreation department, our public works and engineering department, to finance, the budget manager's office, and then myself here in the city manager's office. So there was a lot of interdepartmental or interagency communication and collaboration required, a lot of meetings and kind of working through those different pieces. Which I kind of brings up another piece that was important or played a key part that Molly talked about too, is sort of the the timing of the work being done and then waiting till the end to be able to submit that final reimbursement request, because portions of our project were funded by LWCF and some were not. We had to be very careful about what work was completed when, and so the work included initially in this LWCF project budget, and the timing was informed by when the funding would actually be available and what could be completed before the grant period started and what had to wait or be delayed for those final approvals. And then we had to also make sure that we had the funding to be able to leverage to complete the rest of the project and then to get through it all while we waited for the reimbursement. I think those are the coordinating all those pieces was maybe some of the trickier components for us, but I think when I look at all of the different grants that I've worked on since starting with the town, this one is probably my favorite, even though it is definitely a little bit more involved. But to be able to see that end product and really see the community using it and enjoying it is very rewarding. So it's, for us, it has been a really great experience. And again, I can't emphasize the assistance provided by DNR and how helpful that is. Their guidance was definitely needed, but also very valuable. So if anyone is thinking of applying, if Molly makes herself available, I would encourage everyone to take advantage of that time, because it's going to make you successful with this funding. Otherwise, the general challenges we run into, I think, are probably just consistent with overall just the complexities of federal funding and ensuring compliance. But for us, it was a really great experience.
Great. Thank you so much for sharing those thoughts.
Sure.
Yeah. Steve, you want to share a little more about your experience?
Sure. Yeah, I will say it was a good experience. I would say this was a heavy lift. It was more than a notion, but we did it. And as you can see with our phase 2, we would do it again. I think it was worth it. And I will echo what Leah said as far as DNR support was really phenomenal, to be honest, through the whole process, through the application process, award, reimbursement. There is support that's there. So it is a lot of work. It's a heavy lift, but I think if in this case with this project, we had been sitting on this property for over 25 years, and I think Land Water allowed us to really push this forward. And now we're in phase 2, which is really exciting, which is a lot of the waterfront stuff. So I'll share just a couple quick things as far as lessons learned and whatever else. But the one slide that Molly showed about the different studies and things that you'll have to do in our particular project, we checked every box. We had 3 archaeological studies. We had the tribal review because there was a lot of history at our particular park. So we went through that, through environmental assessments. We were in the critical areas. We had to deal with Army Corps of Engineers and the permitting. So environmental, historic, you name it, we had those issues to deal with. And again, there was support there, but it did take a significant amount of time and effort. So that is, in our case, that was just the nature of that project. That's the things that we had to do. As far as phasing, we phased our project primarily because of resources, but also because of permitting. So in our case, we were on the river, so we had to get Army Corps and MDE to approve. Some of those permits took longer. So our phase 1 included the things that we could get done, and it was also a funding limitation. So we completed that, and then as we are now permitted for all the other pieces, that was when we applied for additional funding for phase 2, and so that's allowed us to kind of push that forward. But that's how that kind of dictated where we went, is what could we get permitted, what could we afford, and we kind of moved in that track. I would say the biggest challenge that we experienced, in addition to all the assessments and different things we had to do, the matching part of it, because we are a small county that has to be creative. We had 7 different grants in this project that we were able to leverage one off the other, including Land Water, that we were able to get the matching funds in addition to the local county funds that we needed to make it work. Tracking that, making sure that all of the expenses match for all of those grants and that you're satisfying every single grant was probably the biggest challenge, even though the application, all of it's a lot of work, but that was probably the most, the trickiest part of that. So we created a spreadsheet. So basically every cost and every expense, I had a line kind of what, like Molly described, land water pays for 50% of whatever this invoice is. And we assigned it out as we went so that when it came time for reimbursement, we kind of had all that together. So if that's something that people are considering, multiple grants to match and leverage, I'm happy to share the spreadsheet we created in that, if that would be helpful. So I'd be certainly glad to share our experience with that. And then as a side note to that, we did, some of you might be aware of this, but with program open space, there's a requirement for a local match. And the rule as we went through phase one was that in our case, it was a 10% match, but the rule was 10% match of the whole project, not just the program open space. So as a quick example, if I got $100,000 program open space, I would need to come up with 10,000 of local match. If I now get $1 million land water and I'm able to find other state funds to match that, the POS rule was that my 10% match, even though I only got 100,000, has to match the whole project. So now I got to come up with, instead of 10,000, I got to come up with $200,000 of match or whatever that is. So that was a challenge, just juggling all that. But the good news to that long-winded story is that the rule changed. There was legislation passed last year that POS now, you only have to match the POS amount to whatever that grant is. So that was helpful. But I think Pirates Wharf, our experience was part of that, is that, you know, counties like ours, we have to cobble together grants to make the thing go. And anyway, that's how we got it done. So we're, I'll close with that. I'll again just say it's not for the faint of heart, but it's definitely worth it. There's support. It's a great program. We've done it twice. We would do it again. I think we have projects not in this cycle, but down the line that we would certainly consider this again. I think it was really great, and we're really appreciative of what we've been able to accomplish through the program. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, both of you, for sharing your experience.